In 1906, a respected doctor walked into a Philippine prison, carrying syringes filled with a disease that would kill in one of the most agonizing ways imaginable. What happened next would be buried by the US government for decades, because the victims weren't just prisoners. They were part of an experiment so horrifying it would change medical ethics forever. This is the true story of Dr. Richard Pearson Strong and the plague experiments that America tried to erase from history. Before we dive into one of the darkest chapters in American medical history, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories they don't teach in schools, are what Curious Historians is all about. We uncover the truth that's been buried for too long. And here's something I want you to think about as we go through this story. At what point does the pursuit of knowledge become evil? Keep that question in mind, because by the end of this video, you're going to have to answer it for yourself. Drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from. Are you in the US, Europe, somewhere else? I want to know who's part of our truth-seeking community. Now, let me take you back to November 1906, to a prison in Manila that would become the site of one of America's most shameful medical experiments. Dr. Richard Pearson Strong wasn't some rogue physician operating in the shadows. He was Harvard-educated, well-respected, and by 1906, he was the director of the biological laboratory at the Bureau of Science in Manila, Philippines. The Philippines had recently become an American territory after the Spanish-American War, and the US government was dealing with a major problem. Tropical diseases were killing American soldiers and civilians at an alarming rate. Cholera, plague, beriberi, these diseases were decimating the colonial population. Strong was sent to Manila with one mission: find cures, develop vaccines, and make the Philippines safe for American expansion. But here's where the story gets dark. Strong needed test subjects. He needed people he could inject with experimental vaccines. Vaccines that hadn't been properly tested. Vaccines that could potentially kill. And in 1906 Manila, he found the perfect population of powerless victims. Bilibid Prison in Manila was overcrowded, underfunded, and filled with Filipino inmates who had no legal representation and no rights under American colonial law. These weren't hardened criminals. Many were political prisoners, Filipinos who had resisted American occupation during the Philippine-American War that had just ended a few years earlier. Others were convicted of minor offenses, theft, vagrancy, violations of colonial curfew laws. But to Dr. Strong and the American colonial administration, they were something else entirely. They were test subjects. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like inside Bilibid in 1906. The prison was designed to hold maybe 800 inmates. By the time Strong arrived, it housed over 1,200. Men were crammed into cells built for half their number. The tropical heat made the stone buildings feel like ovens during the day, and at night, the humidity was so thick you could barely breathe. Food was scarce. The daily ration consisted of rice, sometimes a few vegetables, rarely any protein. Malnutrition was rampant. Diseases spread through the prison like wildfire. Dysentery, tuberculosis, malaria. The prison hospital, if you could even call it that, was little more than a room with a few cots where sick men were left to either recover or die. The guards were a mix of American soldiers and Filipino collaborators, many of whom had their own grudges against the inmates. Beatings were common. So was isolation in what they called the dark cells, windowless stone boxes where men were left for days or weeks at a time. But despite all of this, the prisoners maintained a sense of community. They shared what little they had. They told stories to keep their spirits up. Some of them still believed that someday they would be free, that the American occupation would end, and they could return to their families. Among the prisoners in late 1906 were men whose names we'll never know, men who had fought against American forces, Men who had been teachers, farmers, fishermen in their previous lives. Men who had families waiting for them, not knowing whether they would ever return home. These men had already lost so much: their freedom, their dignity, often their health. But what Dr. Strong was about to take from them was far worse. Their very lives would become nothing more than data points in a medical experiment. The conditions inside Bilibid were already brutal. Prisoners suffered from malnutrition, disease, and abuse. The death rate was high even without medical experimentation. The prison kept meticulous records of deaths, and in a typical month, 5 to 10 prisoners would die from various causes: disease, violence, or simply giving up. But what Strong was about to do would turn this prison into something far worse than a place of punishment. It would become a laboratory of human suffering, where men would be deliberately infected with deadly diseases in the name of science. And here's what makes this even more disturbing. Dr. Strong didn't just walk in and start his experiments randomly. He had a system. He had criteria for selecting his victims. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal shows just how calculated this horror really was. In November 1906, Strong received a shipment of biological materials from the United States. Officially, these were cholera vaccines, experimental serums that Strong intended to test on the prison population to see if they could prevent the disease. But there was a problem. The shipment had been mislabeled. Instead of cholera vaccine, the vials contained something far deadlier: live plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, the same disease that had killed millions during the Black Death in medieval Europe. Now, here's where the story gets murky, and you need to pay close attention because this detail is crucial. Did Strong know what was in those vials? Or was this a tragic accident? The official story, the one the US government would stick to for decades, was that it was a mistake, a shipping error, an unfortunate accident. But the evidence suggests something far more sinister. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you next will make you question everything you thought you knew about medical ethics in America. Before the injections even began, Dr. Strong had to select his subjects. And this is where the cruelty becomes truly calculated. He didn't just pick random prisoners. He selected men who were relatively healthy, because sick prisoners would contaminate the results of his experiment. He needed healthy subjects so he could accurately track the progression of the disease from the moment of infection. Think about that for a second. The prisoners who had managed to survive the brutal conditions of Bilibid, who had somehow stayed healthy despite the malnutrition and disease all around them, those were the ones Strong targeted. Strong also selected prisoners who were serving long sentences. Why? Because he knew they wouldn't be released anytime soon. There would be no family visits, no lawyers asking questions, no outside interference. These men were completely isolated from the world beyond the prison walls. The selection process took several days. Strong would walk through the prison with the warden, examining prisoners like livestock at market. He checked their teeth, their muscle tone, listened to their hearts and lungs. The prisoners had no idea what was happening. Some probably hoped they were being selected for better work assignments or early release. They had no idea they were being chosen to die. On November 26, 1906, Dr. Strong entered Bilibid Prison with his assistants and a case full of syringes. He had selected 24 prisoners for his experiment. The men were told they would be receiving a cholera vaccine, a preventative measure to protect them from disease. They were not told that the injections were experimental. They were not asked for their consent. In fact, consent wasn't even a concept that applied to them. They were prisoners. They were Filipinos under American rule. In the eyes of the colonial administration, they had no right to refuse. The injections took place in the prison hospital. One by one, the prisoners were brought in. Some were nervous. They'd never received any kind of medical treatment before, and the sight of the needles frightened them. Others were hopeful. Maybe this vaccine would protect them from the diseases that were killing their fellow inmates. Strong's assistants held each prisoner's arm steady while Strong administered the injection. The needle went into the muscle of the upper arm. Each man received the same dose, a carefully measured amount of what Strong believed to be cholera vaccine. The prisoners were told to return to their cells and report any unusual symptoms. They were promised that this vaccine would protect them, make them healthier, give them a better chance of surviving their time in Bilibid. It was all a lie. One by one, the prisoners were injected with what Strong believed to be cholera vaccine. But within hours, something went horribly wrong. The first symptoms appeared that same evening. The prisoners began complaining of severe headaches, muscle aches, and sudden chills despite the tropical heat. The prison guards initially dismissed these complaints. Prisoners were always complaining about something, but by the next morning, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. The prisoners began developing symptoms that had nothing to do with cholera. High fever, temperatures so high that some men became delirious, crying out in languages the guards couldn't understand, calling for mothers and wives and children they would never see again. Severe pain, not in the stomach like cholera would cause, but throughout their entire bodies, as if their bones were being crushed from the inside. And then came the most terrifying symptom of all, swelling in the lymph nodes. Large, painful lumps appeared in the prisoners' necks, armpits, and groins, the characteristic buboes that give bubonic plague its name. Strong realized immediately what had happened. The vials had been mislabeled. He had just injected 24 men with live plague bacteria. The Black Death, the disease that had killed a third of Europe's population in the Middle Ages. The most feared disease in human history, and he had just deliberately introduced it into 24 human beings. Now here's what you need to understand. At this point, Strong had a choice. He could have immediately informed the prisoners of what had happened. He could have told them the truth, that this wasn't a cholera vaccine, that they had been infected with plague, that they needed immediate treatment. He could have provided them with the best medical care available. Plague is treatable, especially if caught early. Even in 1906, there were treatments that could have saved some of these men's lives. He could have reported the error to his superiors, faced the consequences, taken responsibility for what was, at minimum, criminal negligence. Instead, he did something different. He watched. He turned this tragedy into an opportunity. He treated the suffering of these 24 men as a scientific experiment, a rare chance to observe the progression of plague in human subjects under controlled conditions. Strong set up a detailed observation protocol. Every 6 hours, he and his assistants would examine the prisoners, taking their temperatures, measuring the size of the buboes, documenting the spread of the infection through their bodies. He took photographs. The images still exist in medical archives. Black and white photos showing emaciated Filipino prisoners, their bodies covered in the characteristic marks of plague, their faces twisted in agony. He took samples, blood, lymph fluid, tissue samples from the buboes. He was documenting the disease's progression with scientific precision. And as the prisoners began to die, screaming in agony, their bodies covered in black necrotic tissue as the plague bacteria destroyed them from T. He inside. Strong continued his research. The prisoners begged for help. They cried out for medicine, for water, for someone to ease their suffering. Some of them, in their delirium, thought they were being punished by God. Others understood exactly what was happening, that they had been poisoned, that the American doctor had done this to them deliberately. But no help came, Strong observed. He documented. He took notes in his careful, precise handwriting, describing the symptoms, the progression, the final moments of each victim. The first prisoner died on November 30th, just 4 days after the injection. His name was never recorded in Strong's official reports. He was simply labeled as subject first. His death was excruciating. The plague had spread through his lymphatic system, causing massive internal bleeding. He coughed up blood in his final hours. His organs failed one by one. Witnesses said his screams could be heard throughout the prison. The other prisoners, the ones who hadn't been injected, were terrified. They could hear what was happening in the hospital ward. They knew that the American doctor had done something terrible to their fellow inmates. By December 10th, 13 of the 24 prisoners were dead. 13 men who had been told they were receiving life-saving medicine had instead been given a death sentence. Each death was documented in clinical detail. Strong noted the time of death, the final symptoms, the condition of the body. He treated these men not as human beings, but as specimens. Their suffering was data. Their deaths were experimental results. Let that sink in. 13 men died in agony, and the doctor who had infected them simply watched and took notes. The 11 prisoners who survived did so not because of any treatment provided by Strong, but because their immune systems managed to fight off the infection. These men went through hell and somehow came out the other side. They were left with permanent damage, scarring, organ dysfunction, and psychological trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Some lost fingers or toes to necrosis. Others suffered chronic pain from the damage to their lymphatic systems. All of them lived with the memory of watching their fellow prisoners die while the American doctors stood by and did nothing. The survivors were kept in isolation for weeks after they recovered, partly to prevent the spread of infection, but also to keep them from telling other prisoners what had really happened. When they were finally allowed to return to the general population, they were different men, hollow-eyed, quiet, haunted by what they had experienced and survived. But here's the truly disturbing part. Strong didn't stop. Even after realizing his mistake, even after watching 13 men die horrible deaths, he continued his experiments. In the months that followed, he conducted additional tests on prisoners, testing different vaccines, different dosages, different disease strains. He published his findings in medical journals, describing the accidental plague inoculation as a valuable opportunity to study the disease's progression in human subjects. His papers were well received by the medical community. He was praised for his scientific rigor and his contribution to understanding tropical diseases. He faced no criminal charges, no investigation, no consequences. The families of the 13 men who died were never informed of what really happened. They were simply told that their loved ones had died of disease, which was technically true, but left out the critical detail that the disease had been deliberately introduced into their bodies by an American doctor. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened next would expose an even darker truth about medical experimentation in America. And if you think this was an isolated incident, you're about to discover just how wrong you are. Don't click away. You need to hear this. The Bilibid prison experiments weren't unique. They were part of a much larger pattern of medical experimentation on vulnerable populations that stretched across decades and continents. In the early 1900s, American doctors regularly used prisoners, mental patients, orphans, and colonized peoples as test subjects. These experiments were conducted without consent, without oversight, and often without any therapeutic benefit to the subjects themselves. Dr. Strong himself would go on to conduct similar experiments in other locations. In 1911, he tested beriberi treatments on Filipino prisoners, deliberately inducing the disease to study its progression. In 1913, he experimented with pellagra on prison populations in the American South. During World War I, he conducted experiments on soldiers, testing vaccines and treatments under conditions that violated basic human rights. And he wasn't alone. The Tuskegee syphilis study, the Guatemala syphilis experiments, the Holmesburg prison experiments, the Willowbrook hepatitis studies. These weren't rogue operations. They were sanctioned, funded, and in many cases, praised by the American medical establishment. So how did doctors like Strong justify what they were doing? The answer reveals something deeply disturbing about how society viewed certain groups of people. Prisoners were seen as having forfeited their rights through their crimes. They were already serving a debt to society. Why not make that debt include contributing to medical science? Colonized peoples, like the Filipinos in Bilibid Prison, were viewed as racially inferior, less capable of feeling pain, less deserving of ethical consideration. The poor, the mentally ill, the institutionalized. All were considered acceptable subjects for experimentation because their lives were deemed less valuable than those of the white, wealthy, educated classes who benefited from medical advances. Strong himself wrote that his experiments were justified because they served the greater good. The knowledge gained from studying plague progression in human subjects, he argued, would save countless lives in the future. But here's the question you have to ask. Who gets to decide whose suffering is acceptable for the greater good? And what happens when that decision is made by people in power about people who have none? Dr. Richard Pearson Strong never faced consequences for what he did at Bilibid Prison. He went on to have a distinguished career. He became a professor at Harvard Medical School. He received numerous awards and honors. He published over 300 scientific papers. When he died in 1948, his obituaries praised him as a pioneer in tropical medicine, a brilliant researcher who had advanced the field immeasurably. The 13 Filipino prisoners who died in agony at Bilibid were never mentioned. Their names were not recorded in most historical accounts. Their families were never compensated. Their suffering was treated as a footnote, an unfortunate accident on the road to medical progress. It wasn't until the 1970s, when the Tuskegee syphilis study was finally exposed, that Americans began to reckon with the dark history of medical experimentation. Congressional hearings revealed the extent of unethical research conducted on vulnerable populations. New regulations were put in place requiring informed consent and institutional review boards. But for the victims of experiments like those at Bilibid Prison, these reforms came too late. The question we have to ask ourselves is this: how many other stories like this are still buried? How many experiments were conducted in the shadows, their victims forgotten, their perpetrators celebrated? The Bilibid prison experiments, along with other scandals like Tuskegee, eventually led to major reforms in medical ethics. The Nuremberg Code of 1947, developed in response to Nazi medical experiments, established the principle of informed consent as fundamental to ethical research. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1964 further strengthened protections for human research subjects. In the United States, the National Research Act of 1974 created a system of institutional review boards that oversee human experimentation today. These reforms were necessary and important, but they came at a terrible cost: the suffering and death of countless individuals who were treated as less than human. So what about justice for the victims? In 2010, more than a century after the Bilibid experiments, the US government formally apologized for the Guatemala syphilis experiments, in which American doctors deliberately infected prisoners and mental patients with sexually transmitted diseases. But there has never been an official apology for what happened at Bilibid Prison. The Philippine government has requested that the United States acknowledge these experiments and provide some form of reparation to the descendants of the victims. As of 2025, that request has not been fulfilled. The names of the 13 men who died are largely unknown. Their graves are unmarked. Their families received no compensation, no acknowledgement, no justice. They were erased from history, casualties not of disease, but of a system that valued scientific progress over human dignity. You might be thinking, this happened over a century ago. Why does it matter now? It matters because the ethical questions raised by the Bilibid experiments are still relevant today. We still conduct medical research on vulnerable populations, though now with more safeguards. We still face questions about who benefits from medical advances and who bears the risks. We still struggle with the legacy of colonial medicine and racial discrimination in healthcare. And we still have to ask ourselves, at what point does the pursuit of knowledge become evil? Before I wrap this up, I want to know what you think. Was Dr. Strong a monster, or was he a product of his time? Could something like this happen today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The story of Dr. Richard Pearson Strong and the Bilibid prison experiments is a reminder that progress often comes at a price, and that price is usually paid by those with the least power to refuse. It's a reminder that medical ethics aren't just abstract principles. They're protections developed in response to real suffering, real exploitation, real deaths. And it's a reminder that we have a responsibility to remember these stories, to speak the names of the forgotten victims, and to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. If this story affected you, if it made you think, if it made you angry, good. That's exactly what history should do. It should challenge us, disturb us, and force us to confront uncomfortable truths. That's what we do here at Curious Historians. We don't just tell you what happened. We make you think about why it matters. If you want more stories like this, stories that they don't teach in schools, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got dozens of buried histories waiting to be uncovered. Check out the video on screen right now. It's about another medical experiment that will absolutely shock you. Or click the playlist for more dark chapters from America's past. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and making sure we do better in the future. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.